I'm making this video on July 13th, 2020. So we're about 6 months into the COVID pandemic. And we're all used to looking at the numbers that come out day after day and saying, okay, how are the numbers doing today? Sort of the new box score of the COVID era, if you will. But you can actually look at this and get a lot deeper insight into what's going on with the pandemic if you scratch your head a little bit. And so what I'd like to do is take you through how to do that. Now, okay, there are the plots. We all see the plots. To truly follow what's going on in detail, you have to dig into the machinery of epidemiology. I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm an astrophysicist, but it turns out that the basic approaches, this is the language of epidemiology that we're looking at here, and it's a language that I speak. So I have the expertise to read into that literature and follow it. But it turns out that you don't need to read into that literature and follow it to keep up with what's actually going. Because to be honest, right now, there's nothing much subtle happening. That a few common sense ideas are enough to give you a pretty good understanding of what's going on with the COVID data and going on with the pandemic. So I want to give you 4 steps to go through when you look at data. The first step is to ask, when did it happen? You see cases appearing, confirmed cases, and they show up today, except that a case that was counted here didn't happen here. In fact, it corresponds to someone who was infected back here somewhere. That gap is typically 2.5, 3 weeks, because that's how long it typically takes to become infected, get to the point that you start to become symptomatic, get to the point that you feel bad enough that you need to go to the hospital, get or be tested, have the test done, get the results back. Finally, those start to show up in the daily statistics. So when you look at today's numbers are telling you about what was going on ballpark 2.5 weeks ago. When did it happen? Take today's confirmed cases, slide that curve back by about 2.5 weeks, give or take. And that gives you a pretty good idea of what was actually happening with the spread of the disease when the infections were occurring. So, step 1, when did it happen? Let's apply that to Arizona, which is where I call home. And right now, Arizona is not a good place to be right now as far as COVID is concerned. Here we go with confirmed cases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, when did it happen? And I'm going to move those back a little over 2 weeks to when the infections were actually occurring. Now, if this tells me when the infections were occurring, I can ask the next question, which is what happened. So, for example, if you look at the data, well, the first thing that you have to do is you have to be sure that your data aren't garbage. You do have problems with the COVID data. For example, in late June, there was a problem in Arizona where something like 2,500 positive test reports were mishandled. And so they didn't show up, then they did show up. Which means what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, I know there's a data problem right there, and I'm just going to smooth over that. Not going to be a big deal, but you have to worry about things like that. Anytime that you see really ratty stuff going on, COVID doesn't change that quickly. And so when you see ratty stuff like this going on, that's probably telling you there's something funny with how the data are being handled. Anyway, so what happened? Well, in Arizona, we were cruising along like this. Again, I'm looking at the red line, which is showing when the infections were occurring. And then suddenly, middle of May, things changed dramatically, and the number of infections really started to climb steeply. So, did anything happen right then? Yeah, that's when Arizona lifted its restrictions. Now notice we lifted restrictions and people would say, hey, look at that. We lifted restrictions and the cases are still down. Boy, isn't this wonderful? We got away with it. No, they didn't, because again, the infections were already, just as soon as the restrictions were lifted, the infections started to climb rapidly. The next thing, if you look at this, is we were doing this and then all of a sudden it just went up like a skyrocket. What happened there? Well, that's Memorial Day. Memorial Day was a big deal. There was a lot. We had just opened up. If you look at it, we had just opened up. Restrictions were lifted. People looking at confirmed cases said, hey, we opened up and the confirmed cases aren't going up very much. This is just great. We can go out and party. And they did. And the result was the number of cases skyrocketed. It skyrockets, you've got that bunch of cases coming in, and then things kind of turn over in here and start looking not so bad again. What happened there? Well, that's when the governor finally decided that instead of telling communities, you may not impose any other restrictions, he told communities, okay, if you want to order people to wear masks, you may do so. And immediately throughout the state, most of the largest communities said, yeah, we're on board with that, and ordered people to start wearing masks. And what you see when you look at the infections is immediately when that mask order went into place, the rate of infections dropped. Again, if you look at it in just the confirmed cases, okay, there was the order and cases kept going up. People were saying, see, masks don't matter, because they didn't understand what they were looking at. All right. When did it happen? 2.5 weeks ago. What happened? Well, when there are breaks, you can go and look and say what happened there, and the answer is you'll find something having to do with public policy, probably. Next question, the next step is to ask, what does it mean? To answer that question, we have to think a little bit about how pandemics actually work. And the key to that is a thing called the reproduction number. Now, you've probably heard this referred to as R naught. I'm going to be a stickler. R naught tells you what the reproduction number is in a setting before anything has been done to do anything about it. So I'm just going to talk about the reproduction number, which changes depending upon our behaviors. What the reproduction number tells you is it tells you on average how many other people a sick person gives the disease to. So, for example, if the reproduction number is 1, that means that a sick person on average gives it to one other person, and they give it to one other person, and they give it to one other person. And so you wind up with just a steady state. The rate of new infections is just level. Same number of people getting new infections every day. If the reproduction number is greater than 1, on the other hand, then the number of new infections climbs. Now we're into the old commercial, for those who remember it. The actress was selling shampoo. And it's, I told 2 friends, and they told 2 friends, and so on and so on. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, you're off to the races. So if the reproduction number is greater than 1, that means that the number of cases is increasing. If the reproduction number is less than 1, now each sick person is giving it to fewer other people than one, fewer than one other person, excuse me. Now what you're going to see is you're going to see the number of infections decreasing over time. And so they decay away. And so all of the business, interventions, whether you're talking about shutting things down or school closures or wearing masks or whatever, it's all about reducing the number of other people a sick person gives the disease to, because that's what controls the spread of the pandemic. For those who are geeky about it, in the very simplest case, it's just you're talking about an exponent. there's what the expression looks like where R is the reproduction number. You can play with it and see why it does what it does here and why reproduction number matters. All right. So let's take that now and look again at Arizona and ask the next question. Take the next step. We've looked at when it happened. We looked at what happened. We now understand something about what it means. Where here in Arizona, case numbers were going up, so they're fairly flat. We were around R equal 1. We opened up, and immediately our reproduction number jumped up substantially higher than 1, and numbers continue to scream upwards, except maybe this mask order thing helped a little bit. If you think about it, this is a hard thing, because here I am on, well, this figure was put together on July 11th, and I'm saying here it is July 11th, and I don't know anything that's happened since kind of late June, because I don't have any data that tells me about anything that has happened since kind of late June. That's why it would be really nice if we had very, very widespread testing of people who were not symptomatic, who weren't coming in and saying, I need to be tested because I'm sick. If we had that widespread testing, we might be able to say something about what's happening today. But given the situation that we're currently in, all we can do is say, I know what things were like 2.5 weeks ago. Which means, as I sit here today, I'm blind to the recent past. I don't know what has been going on for the last 2.5 weeks. Have cases been going up? Have infections been flat? Have infections been decaying away? I don't know. So if I make a decision about a policy, I am making a decision about policy in the face of ignorance about what's actually transpiring on the ground today. And worse than that, if I make a policy today, the repercussions of that policy are not going to start showing up in the data for another 2.5 weeks. So I'm trying to set policy on data that's already 2.5 weeks old, and I'm not going to get any feedback on whether it worked for another 2.5 weeks. What that means is that COVID is an unwieldy monster, but it's an unwieldy monster that can change extremely rapidly. And yet when it does change extremely rapidly, you don't know about it until you've already paid the price. Now, I will say in the case of Arizona, there are maybe some good things that'll go on. It was hopefully in the next few days, we might see the effects of closures of bars, theaters, and gyms that had been opened up, and then things started going up. They said maybe we ought to do something about it. On the other hand, we did have July 4th in there, and July 4th, we didn't get out of the car, but we went to a July 4th event just to watch fireworks, and man, thousands of people walking around up close, no masks. This was out in Apache Junction. That's going to have consequences. But again, we don't know. Decision making is difficult, which means that it's really easy with COVID to get out over your skis, to make decisions without really understanding that you don't have the data to justify those decisions, and you don't know what their consequences are going to be. All right. That was Arizona. You can apply this anywhere. I have looked at a bunch of states. It's worked every time I've looked at it. California, for example, when did it happen? Well, again, here are when you see confirmed cases. Here are when you see, or when the infections actually took place, kind of a couple of weeks earlier than that. What happened? Well, let's cruise along. There we go. Things were going up very rapidly until we noticed that there was a disease here. And that's the point. By the time the county shelter-in-place orders started to go into effect, We were just seeing evidence that maybe there was something going on. In reality, the disease was already widespread. The infections were already out there. County shelter-in-place orders responses started being put in place through here, and it brought the rate of increase down. And I think it probably, from looking at it, that number may actually have been a little bit less than R equal 1. The next change was here, where things were doing not so badly, and then, okay, now they're going up faster. Well, what happened in there? Turns out that was stage 2 reopening through much of California. So there it is, stage 2 reopening. The number of infections starts climbing, and then a couple of weeks later or so, you finally see the number of reported cases climbing. The next thing was here. This was a big one. Things were cruising along, and then bam, things start to skyrocket. That was stage 3 reopening. People talk about the spike in California that started around, June 20th or so. No, that spike in California started back in the first week in June, immediately after stage 3 reopening. There it is. Here's where we saw it. Then up here, it looks like maybe things have gotten better again. There's a kink there. What's going on there? Well, that's where California instituted universal masking. And even though, sitting here in the middle of July, I'm saying that we are only now beginning to unambiguously see the effects of the universal masking order that was put in place back in the middle of June. That's the situation. That's what it means to try to deal with COVID. And I will say again, there have been some things in California, bar closures. There were some business closures in here. I think just today, there were a few more restrictions put in place. Presumably those are being informed by this, but also testing data. Boy, it'd be nice if we had better testing data. You get the idea. Anyway, when did it happen? What happened? What does it mean? What will happen? Everywhere. Let's look at Florida. Florida, again, the blue showing where the cases are reported, the red showing when the infections occurred. Here was Florida, phase 1 reopening. Boom, infections immediately start climbing. People look, oh, we just did our phase 1 reopening and cases aren't going up. I guess that means it's safe to do phase 2, so they do phase 2. Florida was already out of control in terms of number of infections. They did phase 2. Okay, off to the races. When did it happen? What happened? What does it mean? What will happen? Texas, same thing. Texas was cruising along here and had been playing around. Texas does its phase 2 reopening. And for those looking at the cases, they said, hey, man, we just did our phase 2 reopening. And look at that. Our reported numbers are even going down. This is great. Of course, in reality, what happened was that with the phase 2 reopening, immediately the number of infections started to climb. We just didn't see them for a while. And then if you look here on the number of infections, they were doing this, and then they just took off like a rocket. Well, what happened there? That was their phase 3 reopening. And so they were looking and saying, hey, how about that? We did phase 3 reopening, and it's not that bad. Hey, we got away with it. No, you didn't. New York. New York is a really interesting case because New York actually kind of got their act together and did it right. So let's look at New York. First of all, here were the reported cases. Let's take it back in time about 2.5 weeks to when the infections were actually going on. So here it was in kind of mid-March when people said, oh my goodness, we're starting to see cases in New York. In point of fact, when people first started to see cases showing up in New York had already almost reached its peak in terms of the number of infections that were happening. So people think of COVID as being something that got out of hand in New York here in mid-April. No, COVID got out of hand in New York back here in late March. It's just that they didn't know it. Anyway, number of infections. The number of infections are skyrocketing. Something clearly happened in here. And the answer is, yeah, it did. Right there is where Cuomo locked down New York. So what happened after that? Well, what happened after that is the number of infections started falling. And this is kind of fun because the number of infections started falling. If you ignore that kind of blip right there, sort of draw a smooth line through this, the number of infections started falling, just exponential decay. Here we have 2.5 weeks, and over the course of 2.5 weeks, the number of infections dropped by a factor of 2. And there you go 2.5 weeks, and the number of infections dropped by a factor of 2. And there you go 2.5 weeks, and the number of infections dropped by a factor of 2. So when you look at what happened on the backside of New York locked things down, kept them locked down. And we saw nice exponential decay on the backside with a half-life of about 2.5 weeks. All right, so there's New York. We now have enough information to look at cases and actually start saying really interesting things about the future. So, for example, here's Virginia. Virginia, the blue is showing the number of confirmed cases. The orange here is showing that curve just moved back by 2.5 weeks. So when the infections were taking place, you look at what's going on in Virginia. And in Virginia, man, look at that. Numbers of infections were falling very nicely. So what they were doing was working. But then on, I think it was, well, anyway, it was May 28th or something like that, they did their phase 1 reopening in the northern part of the state. The northern part of the state being where most of the people are. And immediately you saw this decline in the number of infections in Virginia go to instead flat. So they went from a reproduction number that was very nicely less than 1. They were doing a really good job. And now they've got a reproduction number of about 1. And then you look here and say, somewhere right around here, that happened. And the right around there was their phase 2 reopening. So if you were naively looking at the data, you said, oh, we did our phase 1, and even though we've done our phase 1 opening, our cases are still coming down. Man, this is great. And then you say, we did our phase 2, and even though we did our phase 2, we've still got flat case numbers. Man, this is great. Everything's working. When the reality was that phase 1, things were flat. Phase 2, the number of infections started to climb, doing that. And then Virginia did phase 3. So Virginia did phase 3 here, imagining that, oh, look at that, our case numbers are level, this is fine, it's all right. We can do phase 3. Virginia's like everywhere else in the United States, phase 3 means that cases will start to go up again. And so it's really that easy to look at Virginia and say, you know, you are starting to see numbers go up. People are naively saying, well, we were doing okay and we went to phase 3 and okay, phase 3, we're seeing numbers climb a little bit. No. The recent little bit of climb in numbers isn't because of phase 3 reopening, it's because of phase 2 reopening. And you're not even going to start seeing the consequences of phase 3 reopening for a while. Virginia has not even begun to see the consequences of phase 3 as I speak. It has only just started to see the consequences of phase 2. I should say that little over a week ago, I gave a talk to a bunch of educators in Virginia, and at which point their data just looked like this. And they had just done phase 2. And I said, you know that you guys in the next few days are going to see your numbers start going up. That was not a welcome message, but I said it's going to happen. And sure enough, I predict it. Here it is. And then I went back and talked to them again this weekend. And I said, by the way, you guys should know that come, a week from now, you're going to start seeing your numbers go up again. That's my prediction. I hope I'm wrong. I don't think I am. So anyway, it's not hard to predict an outbreak in Virginia, likely to start in the 4th week of July, because there it is. If you look at the number of infections were going up, and the reopening there we go. That's what's likely to happen in Virginia. Virginia is going to see an outbreak, and it's going to be an outbreak that's kind of like the outbreak that we saw in, hopefully not as bad as the outbreaks in Arizona and Texas and Florida and California. But there will be an outbreak, and it will be an outbreak caused by exactly the same thing. People getting too far out over their skis, acting without really understanding what's going on. Now, I'll be honest and say I'm an astrophysicist sitting here dealing with publicly available data. I think somebody is putting politics ahead of science here, and they haven't quite figured out that COVID just doesn't really care about what they find politically expedient. Okay, let's look at the United States as a whole now, and I'd like to look at the United States not as the entire United States, but rather the United States minus New York and New Jersey. Because remember, I showed you before that New York got its act together quickly and the numbers came down. New Jersey did the same thing. So let's pull New York and New Jersey out of the United States as a whole and see what it looks like. Well, if you do that, then the number of confirmed cases in the United States looks like this. Okay. So first question, when did it happen? Well, slide it back about 2.5 weeks to say when were infections throughout the country taking place. And that's the answer. And you look at it and you say, all right, so cases were really climbing here. This in late February is where things really started to take off in the United States. It was in March when we started noticing it. So it was kind of in this area that we started seeing piecemeal shutdowns. Places that were saying, hey, we're getting lots of cases, started to close things down. The United States never got to the point where we had a reproduction number less than 1. We never got to the point where the number of new infections was declining. We only got to the point where the number of new infections was staying about the same. So there we are. The only reason when you looked at the data from the nations as a whole, it appeared that things were coming down, was that you were looking at the numbers from New York and New Jersey. Throughout the rest of the nation, nope, we reached on average a reproduction number of about 1. And things were cruising along, and then clearly right here something happened. Man, we went from this to things just going through the roof. Yeah, you remember mid-May, all of the, we're now into Liberate Michigan was back in here. This was when people were screaming, reopen, 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 reopen. And so it was in mid to late May that the reopening started taking place. And sure enough, what happened throughout the nation is that the number of infections started screaming upward again. And 2.5 weeks later, there you see the number of reported cases going with it. So there we are, from growth, reproduction number greater than 1. The United States got to the point where the reproduction number on average was around 1, which means in here people were getting sick and people were dying and the economy was being trashed and all of that kind of stuff, except we weren't actually doing anything to get the disease under control. We were doing nothing but treading water. Then we reopened and off and away it goes. What comes next? We as a nation are not doing anything still to get this underhand. California is shutting down again. There's some piecemeal here, there, and the other place. Hopefully these numbers will start to do this as different states do something to stop it. The thing is, this period between late March and late May are the wasted 2 months when a real, honest-to-goodness national shutdown would have saved us. Let's imagine that back here when New York had shut down, that the whole country had shut down at the same time and as hard. What would have happened? Well, there's that exponential decay that we saw in New York. That's what it would have looked like had we done that as a nation. Had we done the science thing instead of the save the Dow thing, then at this point, instead of here, we actually would have our numbers low enough that we could reasonably talk about a lot of reopening and maybe even letting kids go back to school and that kind of stuff. But we didn't. The United States didn't just mishandle COVID. The United States almost optimally mishandled COVID. If you take the increasing number of infections today and take it back and compare it with what we were doing here, we were doing this and now we're just climbing right on up as if nothing had happened, with the exception of, I don't know, 100,000 lives, a couple of $1 trillion spent, impact on the economy, so on and so forth. It's difficult to imagine inflicting more damage than we did. Again, it's like we optimized the bad way to handle COVID. And you can see this. Again, let's look at nations. There we go, Spain. Reproduction number greater than 1. If I were to slide this back a couple of weeks, you'd find that the infections were high here. They started imposing restrictions. Sure enough, the infections came down and the case reports did as well. There they go. They shut it down and you get exponential decline. There's Italy. Same thing happened. They shut it down. The number of infections were back here, and so they closed things down back here, which means that this is where the new infections stopped, and by the time you got to here, that's where you started seeing the cases declining. Here's Germany. Same story. That's just the European Union as a whole. Same story. Boy, they're the folks who got it right. There's New Zealand. Man, they saw that there were cases or the possibility of cases. They jumped on it hard. They shut things down tight. They kept them shut down until they're at a point today where New Zealand essentially considers itself to be COVID-free. Great Britain, United Kingdom, started to do reasonable things, decided, oh, no, we can't do that, it's not going to work, and eased up, and things got bad until they finally realized, oh, science maybe matters after all, and they have done more to get things under control. And there's the United States. Again, I just talked about that. Optimally bad. Well, maybe not optimally bad. It turns out that there is a nation that actually did it worse. And that's Israel. Israel actually did react They shut things down. They kept them shut down reasonably well. They got the exponential decline. They got their numbers down low. And then they looked and said, oh, wow, our numbers are down low. That means we can start opening up again. And that's what happened. Anyway, one other nation worth mentioning is Sweden. Sweden didn't shut things down. They just kind of asked people to be reasonable. And what actually happened in Sweden is they asked people to be reasonable as well. Maybe it was going to be okay, except really it isn't. I think Sweden at this point has the highest fatality rates in Europe and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's how it is. COVID makes the rules. It's not at all hard to look at the data and understand what the data are really telling us. The data always tell us exactly the same thing. And that is that if you give COVID the slightest opportunity, it will find a way. And that if you look at numbers today and imagine, oh, I guess this means that I can ease off, then you're wrong. We're at a point right now where we're coming up on states saying that, oh, we can, look, our numbers are flat, we can open schools. No, you can't. If you start opening schools, schools are going to become sites where the infection spreads. It's not just about endangering kids. It's not just about endangering teachers. It's about you're gonna do huge damage to public health. I actually kind of have to laugh because there are a lot of people everywhere from the White House all the way down to school superintendents who think that what they say matters. That somehow if they say something, then that's going to happen. I say we're going to go back to school, and by golly, we're going to go back to school. Well, you try to go back to school right now in most places, and what's going to happen is that by the time you're 2 weeks in, you're going to have a logistical nightmare on your hands because there are going to be outbreaks at some schools and not at others, and this and that and the other thing, and overall numbers are going to be going up. And so even the places that try to open schools in the early part of the fall aren't going to get away with it. Even places where things look good. The thing is, people travel. There's mobility. And what we know about COVID is that COVID, you get one super spreader of COVID in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you just dropped a match in kindling, and away it goes. So anyway, there you go. You do not need an advanced degree in epidemiology or even a degree in physics to be able to look at the COVID numbers and make sense of them. 4 easy steps. First, when did it happen? Take the current cases, slide them back something like 2.5 weeks to see when infections were going on. 2, what happened? When you do that, you see places where there are kinks in the infection rate. And if you go and poke around, turns out Wikipedia has some nice pages that capture timelines of state actions. And you just say, okay, here's this date. I wonder what happened on this date. And then you go and you look at the history. Oh, yeah, that's when they went to phase 2 or whatever. What does it mean? It means that anything that you do that allows people to interact more means that you're going to increase the reproduction number, means that you're going to see an increase in the rate of infections. And what will happen? Well, what will happen is that if you get out over your skis, you'll get yourself in trouble. If you imagine that somehow today's numbers are telling you about today, and you act accordingly, then you run the risk of stepping into a situation that is already bad and making it worse, and then not even knowing what you've done until it's had time to burn the forest down. So there you go. That's how you can look at the numbers, make some sense out of COVID. Uh, you know, enjoy your new career as armchair epidemiologist. And as you look at this and as you see things happen, also be a voice for reason. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. I hope this is useful. And I just want to leave with one thought. Normal. Everybody wants to get back to normal. The only place that normal exists anymore is in our memories and in our dreams. There is no normal to return to. Right now, maybe something on the high side of 5 or 6% of the nation has actually had this thing. We think probably something like 70% immunity will be required before we get to herd immunity. And it's not even clear that just having this thing will give immunity. So this isn't something that's about over. We are in the bottom of the first in a game that could easily go to extra innings. And we really need to stop pretending that the game's about over. We really need to stop pretending that we can ignore COVID or tell COVID what to do, and instead face up to the realities and, start applying our imaginations and our will and our ability and our resources to making life the best it can be in the face of this thing until such a time as things like vaccines start showing up. That's not an easy story, but it's reality. And, COVID's making the rules. Thank you.